1 hour after she was named chief executive, Vivian Blackwood walked into the boardroom, looked at the ex-husband who was raising their daughter alone, and coldly fired him. The executives laughed when Nolan Reed set his employee badge on the table and said, "By morning, you will need me." They assumed it was nothing more than the bitterness of a defeated engineer. But before dawn, the company's core system went dark. A contract worth billions stood on the edge of collapse, and Vivian appeared at Nolan's door, begging him to save the empire that was supposed to be hers. Please subscribe to follow the unraveling of a powerful board and the way one single dad forced an entire empire to bow its head. The morning Aurelius Mobility summoned its people to the atrium. No one expected the announcement to arrive, wrapped in the language of loyalty and sacrifice. Vivian Blackwood stood at the center of the raised platform, the youngest chief executive in the company's history, and the applause that met her was loud, practiced, and slightly afraid. Nolan Reed stood near the back wall, close to the tall windows that looked out over the gray Chicago skyline, and he clapped exactly long enough to be polite, and not one moment longer. He understood better than anyone else in that room that Vivian could not afford to have a single person believe she had been lifted into power by the man she had once married. So he kept his distance, kept his hands still, and let the moment belong entirely to her. That restraint, that refusal to claim even a sliver of her success, was the very quality the powerful men in that building had already decided to punish. Gideon Ashcroft took the platform after her, his voice soft and grandfatherly, and he praised Vivian as a leader who was willing to cut away the past in order to protect the future. The board chairman spoke the way wealthy men speak, when they have already decided the outcome of a story and only need the audience to nod along. Preston Carrington followed with a presentation that framed itself as a strategy for acceleration, and on the second slide he displayed a list of names the company considered too slow, too cautious, too attached to old habits. Nolan Reed's name sat at the very top of that list. For months, Nolan had been sending careful, documented warnings that a new security certificate package could force the entire Sentinel grid to lock down its whole fleet of automated trucks. Every one of those warnings had been quietly rewritten, reframed, and stripped of its engineering context until it read like the sabotage of a bitter man nursing a grudge after a divorce. What Nolan did not know that morning was that Vivian had received a private ultimatum from Gideon the night before. Either she removed Nolan on her very first day, proving she could sever old ties without flinching, or the board would treat her as a woman too compromised by her past to lead a company of this size. She read the ultimatum 3 times in the dark of her new office, and each time she told herself that leadership demanded a certain coldness. She chose the career. She chose the title. And when the applause finally faded, she called Nolan into the glass conference room in front of the entire executive team, because a private dismissal would not satisfy the men who were watching to see whether she had the stomach for it. As Nolan crossed the floor toward that glass room, Preston Carrington spoke just loudly enough for the nearby executives to hear him clearly. An engineer who spends this much of his time worrying about his family, Preston said, cannot possibly be trusted to decide the speed of a company worth billions. No one objected. No one pushed back. A few of the directors actually smiled, because in that world a joke at the expense of a quiet man was simply the sound of the pecking order confirming itself. Nolan heard every word and let it pass through him without reaction, the way a bridge lets wind pass through its cables. He had learned long ago that the men who mistook his calm for weakness were the same men who had never once been tested by a real crisis. And then he stepped into the room, and Vivian opened the personnel folder, and she looked at him with an expression she had spent all night rehearsing. "Effective immediately," she said. "You no longer work for Aurelius Mobility." The words landed in the glass room like a stone dropped into still water, and for a moment even the men who had smiled outside grew quiet. Vivian pressed on, because stopping now would look like doubt, and she accused Nolan of resisting the new strategy, of spreading fear through the engineering floor, and of leaning on their old relationship to influence the leadership she was now meant to command. She said these things in a steady voice, and only someone who had once loved her would have caught the faint tremor underneath it. Nolan did not argue about the marriage. He did not raise his voice, did not mention their years together, and did not so much as glance toward the memories that hung between them. Instead, he asked her a single quiet question, whether she had actually read the hardware compatibility assessment, the one that examined how the new certificates would behave on the older generations of controllers still running out on the highways. Preston cut in before she could answer, announcing with a wave of his hand that the new engineering team had already confirmed the entire system was completely safe. Nolan turned his eyes toward the validation signature on the report. Preston waved, and he recognized instantly that it belonged to a contractor who had never once tested anything on the older controller boards. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The new certificates were scheduled to activate at 13 minutes past 2 in the morning. He told the room, plainly and without drama, that firing him would not stop Safe Harbor from doing exactly what he had designed it to do. Gideon Ashcroft chuckled and accused Nolan of hiding behind technical language to frighten a chief executive on her first day. One of the directors added, almost lazily, that Nolan would come crawling back to beg for his job the moment he remembered he had a mortgage and a child to feed. Vivian kept her face carved from ice, and she ordered security to collect Nolan's badge and escort him from the building. As he passed close to her on his way to the door, he did not beg, did not flare into anger, and did not reach into the wreckage of their shared history for a weapon to hurt her with. "I am not cursing this company, Vivian," he said quietly, so that only she and those nearest could hear. "I simply understand the thing you just allowed them to switch on." Then he walked to the whiteboard at the head of the room, uncapped a marker, and wrote 3 characters where everyone could see them, a single stark time. 2:13 a.m. He set his badge down on the polished table beside it and said, "By morning, you will need me more than you have ever needed anyone." Preston laughed out loud at that, a sharp, dismissive bark of a laugh, but Mara Quinn, the company's head of legal and compliance, stared at those 3 numbers on the board and felt something cold settle into her stomach. She left the room without a word and went straight to her desk, and there she reopened the warning file that Preston had ordered her to close and bury weeks before. Nolan drove home through the emptying streets and let himself into the small apartment he shared with his daughter, and he hid the fact of his firing behind an ordinary evening so that Ellie would not have to carry a grown man's problems on her 11-year-old shoulders. She looked up from her homework and asked him why he was home so early, and he crouched beside her chair and told her a simple truth she could hold without fear. "The company was changing," he said, "and sometimes when companies change, adults have to pay the price for the choices other adults have made." She studied his face for a moment with the frank, searching honesty that children have, decided that he was steady, and went back to her math. He made her dinner, listened to her talk about a science project involving bridges and tension, and tucked her into bed with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything he did. Only after her breathing had slowed into sleep did he open the small box on the top shelf of his closet, the one that held his own legal, personal copies of the Safe Harbor design notes. He did not log into the company's network. He did not reach for a back door, did not plant anything, did not so much as touch a keyboard connected to Aurelius. He simply sat at his kitchen table in the lamplight and waited to learn whether the warning he had spent months trying to deliver had been right all along. He had spent 11 years at the company, longer than almost anyone still on the floor, and he had watched it grow from a stubborn little firm with a single test truck into a network that moved the freight of a continent. In the early years, before the money arrived and the men in soft voices arrived with it, the engineers had believed that building something safe was the same as building something great. Nolan had never let go of that belief, even as it slowly went out of fashion, even as ambition became the only language the leadership seemed to understand. He had built Safe Harbor to be the conscience the company itself refused to be, a layer of protection that would refuse to let 18,000 automated trucks keep driving on a security certificate that could not be trusted. It was not a clever trick or a hidden weapon. It was the simplest promise an engineer could make, that a machine entrusted with human lives would rather stop than gamble, and he had written that promise into the deepest part of the system precisely so that no ambitious man in a corner office could ever quietly delete it. At 13 minutes past 2 in the morning, exactly as the whiteboard had promised, the Aurelius Operations Center lit up with thousands of alerts cascading across every display. One convoy after another eased off the interstates, hunted for the nearest safe shoulder or rest area, and locked its controllers into a protective sleep. It was not chaos. It was the opposite of chaos. It was a machine doing precisely what it had been designed to do, and the people who ran the company had no idea how to make it stop. Warehouses across the country stopped receiving the raw materials their production lines depended on. 2 factories were forced to idle their assembly lines by dawn. The company's single largest partner began drafting the language it would use to cancel a contract worth $4.2 billion. Preston Carrington issued a remote command to shut Safe Harbor down and force the fleet back onto the road, and the system refused him, because obeying that command would mean letting the trucks run on the very certificates it had already flagged as false. The new engineering team, the one Preston had assembled to move fast and ask few questions, could not understand why 3 different generations of controllers were each responding in a different way to the same update. Gideon Ashcroft called Vivienne to the headquarters before the sun rose and told her, in that soft and terrible voice, that she needed to restore the system before the markets opened, or her tenure would end before it had truly begun. Preston stood in the corner of the operations center and began, carefully and deliberately, to plant a story, murmuring that perhaps Nolan had left behind a hidden timer, a piece of vengeful sabotage set to detonate the moment he was pushed out the door. Vivienne very nearly believed him because the story was clean and it absolved her of everything, until Mara Quinn walked into the room and set a printed document on the table in front of her. It was the report Nolan had submitted 6 weeks earlier, the one Preston had ordered buried, and in it Nolan had predicted, with unsettling precision, the exact time and the exact symptoms of the failure now unfolding across the country. Vivienne read it twice, and slowly the shape of the truth rearranged itself in her mind. Safe Harbor had not caused this crisis. Safe Harbor had prevented a far worse one, stepping in front of 18,000 vehicles to stop them from racing across the nation on a broken and untrustworthy security layer. Nolan had not destroyed the company. His design had shielded it, and the man they had humiliated in front of the entire executive team was the only person alive who understood the full and tangled relationship between the aging hardware, the new certificates, and the protective mechanism now holding the fleet in place. At 47 minutes past 4 in the morning, Vivienne got into her car and drove to Nolan's apartment, and she stood before the door she herself had walked out of 3 years earlier. Nolan opened it still wearing the same shirt he had worn to his own firing, because he had never gone to bed, and he found his ex-wife standing in the pale hallway light with none of the ice she had carried in the boardroom. She admitted, without preamble, that Sentinel Grid had frozen and that no one inside the company knew how to bring it back safely. He looked at her for a long moment and asked her, evenly, whether she had come as the chief executive, as his ex-wife, or as a woman who had just realized she had been deceived. She said she needed him to save the company and the thousands of jobs that hung on it. He told her that he would not walk back through those doors on the strength of a spoken apology delivered at 4 in the morning. The problem, he explained, was not only in the software, because the person who had erased his warnings still controlled the company's data, and that meant any fix he built could be sabotaged, reversed, or used to hide the evidence of what had truly been done. Vivian offered to pay him 3 times his former salary, the words tumbling out before she could measure them. Nolan almost smiled at that, and he told her that Preston had made a fundamental mistake in assuming that every single father could be bought with the fear of losing his income. Then he laid out 5 conditions, and he insisted that every one of them be put in writing before he touched a single machine. First, he would hold complete technical authority for the entire duration of the crisis, answerable to no one on the operational floor. Second, the 3 engineers who had been fired for objecting to the flawed update would be recalled immediately and reinstated. Third, no one, under any pressure and for any reason, would be permitted to switch off safe harbor to force the trucks back onto the road before they were verified as safe. Fourth, every system log would be preserved untouched and complete for an independent investigation. And fifth, Vivian would publicly acknowledge that Nolan had sent his warnings before she fired him. She hesitated at the final condition because she understood exactly what it would cost her, that admitting she had removed him against documented evidence could hand the board the excuse it needed to take her chair. Nolan watched the hesitation move across her face and reached to close the door. She stopped it with her hand, and for the first time she spoke to him without strategy, without calculation, without the armor she had worn for years. "I was wrong," she said. "Not just last night. I was wrong to believe that making you smaller would make me look stronger." Nolan did not forgive her in that moment. He did not soften, did not reach for her, did not offer the reconciliation she may have been hoping to hear. He simply reached back inside, took a pen and a pad of paper from the table by the door, and held them out to her. Vivian took them, and standing there in the hallway at the edge of dawn, she signed every condition he had written, including the line that gave Nolan the power to halt the company's operations entirely if the board ever tried to force him to violate the safety of the system. Nolan returned to Aurelius less than 12 hours after security had marched him out of the building. His old badge was still locked out of the system, and the young man at the reception desk shifted uncomfortably when he realized he had been given an instruction to keep this particular visitor from entering. Before the awkwardness could harden into a confrontation, Vivian came down to the lobby herself, opened the gate with her own credentials, and announced to everyone within earshot that Nolan Reed was now the technical commander of the crisis. The directors who had laughed at him the previous morning found themselves stepping aside to let him pass. In the emergency operations room, Gideon Ashcroft refused, on a matter of pure pride, to surrender the seat at the head of the long table. Vivian walked over, took hold of the chief executive's chair, and pulled it deliberately to one side. "Today," she said, loud enough for the whole room, "the person who understands the system will sit here." Nolan called back the 3 engineers Preston had fired, Tessa Monroe, Wyatt Cole, and Grant Ellis, each of whom had been pushed out for raising the same objections he had. He divided the crisis into 3 distinct layers: certificate authentication, hardware compatibility, and a full audit of every administrative command that had touched the fleet. Preston hovered at the edge of the room and pressed him again and again to switch off safe harbor and restart the trucks to protect the collapsing stock price. Nolan refused, explaining with careful patience that doing so could turn thousands of freight trucks into machines with no verifiable identity, moving objects on the interstate that the network could no longer trust or confirm. Gideon, watching his leverage slip, called Nolan an embittered ex-husband exploiting a panic to seize power he had not earned. Nolan answered him without heat, saying the chairman was welcome to fire him a second time the instant he was willing to sign a document accepting personal responsibility for every accident that would follow. Gideon fell silent in front of the entire room, and the silence told everyone watching more than any argument could have. As the hours ground on, Nolan's team uncovered something that turned the crisis from an accident into a design. The failure had not been random at all. An update had been deliberately pushed through while skipping the exact layer of testing that Nolan had always required before any certificate reached the fleet. And when they traced the approval back through the chain of signatures, the final authorization, the one that had waved the untested update forward, belonged to Preston Carrington. Nolan asked Vivienne to revoke Preston's system access at once. The moment the request was spoken aloud, the validation logs, the very records that would prove what Preston had done, began to vanish, deleted one after another from a device somewhere outside the building, someone racing to erase the evidence before it could be locked away. Nolan immediately ordered the remote administrative privileges severed and the archive servers physically isolated from the network. Preston denied everything, insisting the deletions were nothing more than a routine, automated data cleaning process that ran on a schedule. Mara Quinn, standing near the door with her arms crossed, stated flatly that the company had no policy of automatically purging logs during a crisis, and certainly none that would trigger in the middle of the night. Vivienne ordered Preston's access suspended on the spot. Gideon objected with a sudden, sharp anger that did not match his usual soft manner, reminding Vivienne that it was Preston who had helped secure her appointment as chief executive in the first place. That single detail, spoken in the heat of the argument, made the whole picture snap into focus for her. The two men had prepared her chair for her long before she ever sat in it. Nolan and his engineers, working from an offline backup Grant had thought to preserve, managed to recover a portion of the deleted data, and inside it they found a chain of messages showing that Preston had been explicitly warned the new certificate vendor did not meet the required standard. The recovery itself was painstaking, a slow reconstruction of fragments pulled from a drive that someone had tried to wipe in a hurry, and Tessa worked through the corrupted sectors with the steady focus of a person diffusing something delicate. Piece by piece, the messages assembled themselves on the screen, and each one made the picture uglier than the last. Preston had not simply overlooked a risk or made an honest error of judgment. He had been told in plain language, by an outside auditor no less, that the cheaper vendor could not certify the older controller boards, and he had answered that message with a single instruction to proceed anyway. Nolan read that reply twice and felt something harden inside him, because it was one thing to be careless with a company, and another thing entirely to be deliberate with the lives riding inside 18,000 trucks. He did not raise his voice or slam a hand on the table. He simply asked Grant to preserve a second copy of everything, and then a third, in a location no one in that building could reach. Another message, buried deeper in the recovered files, revealed something larger and colder. Gideon Ashcroft had been quietly negotiating for a fund controlled by his own family, Ashcroft Capital, to buy Aurelius Mobility outright once the stock had collapsed. The plan, laid bare in the messages, was elegant in its cruelty. Push the flawed update into the system. Fire Nolan to remove the one person capable of stopping it. Shift the blame onto the newly appointed chief executive. Let the value of the company crater under the weight of the crisis. And then acquire Aurelius at a fraction of its worth, folding an entire empire into the family's holdings. Vivienne understood at last that she had never been handed power at all. She had been chosen to be the one who would take the fall. Preston, cornered, spun the accusation around and declared that Nolan had forged the messages out of hatred for the woman who had divorced him. Nolan did not argue the point. He simply asked Mara to compare the digital signatures and the storage timestamps against the records held on the independent legal server, the one no one inside the operations center could reach or alter. The digital signatures confirmed that the messages were genuine. And more than that, the records showed that a copy of the original warning had in fact been sent to Vivienne herself, weeks earlier, but that an assistant working for Preston had moved the message into an archive folder before she ever laid eyes on it. Vivienne stood very still as she absorbed this, understanding now that Nolan had never wanted her to fail. For weeks, he had been trying to protect both the company and the future of her leadership at the same time, and in return, she had fired him in front of the very men who were plotting her ruin. Gideon, seeing the ground collapse beneath him, called an emergency session of the board, intending to strip Vivienne of her position and formally accuse Nolan of sabotaging the enterprise. The board convened in the cold gray hour before the markets opened, and for the first time in his long career, Gideon Ashcroft felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had spent 4 decades learning how rooms worked, how fear could be shaped and pointed like a tool, how frightened men would always reach for the version of events that let them sleep at night. He had built his family's fortune on that knowledge, on arriving at the exact moment a company was too weak to resist and too proud to admit it, and he had believed Aurelius would be no different. What he had not counted on was a single engineer who could not be bought, could not be baited, and could not be made afraid, and who had somehow convinced the woman Gideon had installed as a puppet to stop reading from the script. Gideon presented Nolan to them as a disgruntled former employee manipulating his ex-wife for revenge. He proposed a slate of clean, decisive actions: remove Vivienne, hand temporary control of the company to Preston, accept an emergency acquisition offer from Ashcroft Capital, and file suit against Nolan to reassure the frightened partners. Several members of the board, terrified of watching the company slide into bankruptcy on their watch, nodded along. Preston stood and declared that all it would take was 10 minutes with safe harbor switched off, and the fleet could roll again, and the stock price could be saved before the opening bell. Nolan rose and presented a simulation, projected onto the wall, showing that the very approach Preston proposed could allow the trucks to accept driving commands from an unverified and untrusted source. Gideon sneered that Nolan was merely an engineer who did not understand finance. Nolan let the insult sit in the air for a moment before he answered it. "You are right," he said. "I do not understand the kind of finance that requires thousands of people to lose their jobs so that one family can buy a company at a discount." Mara stepped forward and laid the authenticated chain of messages before the board. Preston kept denying, arguing that choosing a cheaper certificate vendor had been nothing more than a reasonable effort to cut costs. Then the board turned to Vivienne and demanded that she cast a vote, forcing her to choose between protecting Nolan and keeping her own chair. She stood, and in front of the entire board she admitted that she had fired Nolan without ever verifying the evidence against him. She read aloud the conditions he had set, confirming for all of them that he had asked for no equity, no title, and no bonus, only for the safety of the system and the truth to be preserved. Vivienne declared that she was fully prepared to lose her position, but that she would not stand by and allow the board to turn Nolan into a scapegoat for a disaster he had spent months trying to prevent. Then came the moment that shifted the room entirely. Mara revealed that before the meeting had even begun, she had already delivered the complete file to the Independent Audit Committee. Gideon no longer held any control over the investigation. It had passed beyond his reach the moment those documents left the building. 3 members of the board who had spent the whole morning silent, watching to see which way the wind would blow, now shifted their weight and voted to suspend both Gideon and Preston pending the investigation. Gideon was stripped of his authority to chair the session, and the gavel passed to another hand. But before he gathered his coat and walked out, he turned to Nolan with a thin, knowing smile and delivered a final warning that whatever else had happened in that room, the company still had only 6 hours left before its largest partner would cancel the $4.2 billion contract for good. Exposing the conspiracy had not, on its own, saved anything. More than 18,000 trucks still sat frozen on shoulders, and in rest areas across the country, customers were running out of patience, and the federal safety regulator was demanding hard proof that the fleet could be trusted before it moved again. Nolan could not simply delete the new certificates and start over, because some of the controllers had already installed the update partway, leaving them in a fragile in-between state that a blunt reversal could break entirely. He proposed a recovery in 3 stages instead. First, reissue valid certificates from the original trusted vendor. Second, test each generation of hardware separately rather than trusting them all at once. Third, bring the fleet back region by region instead of throwing every switch at the same moment. The board wanted it finished in 2 hours. Nolan held firm and insisted on 6, because rushing would only manufacture a new and larger risk on top of the one they were already fighting. Vivian stood beside him and backed him openly, accepting that the stock would keep sliding rather than force an unsafe restart to please the markets. As the team worked, Tessa discovered that a cluster of trucks had never received the new certificates at all, because Preston had quietly diverted them onto a testing server, hiding them from the very process that was supposed to protect them. Wyatt tracked down the old compatibility map, the one Nolan had insisted on preserving offline against exactly this kind of day. And Grant found something none of them had expected. Safe Harbor had, on its own, generated a detailed record confirming that every single truck had come to a stop according to the proper safety procedure. A clean and unbroken account of 18,000 vehicles behaving exactly as designed. That record became the key that unlocked the regulator's cooperation, hard evidence that the safety system had not failed but had performed flawlessly. Nolan picked up the phone and called the operations director of the largest customer directly, and instead of offering hollow promises, he walked the man through the recovery plan milestone by verifiable milestone. The customer agreed to extend the deadline by another 6 hours, on the single condition that Nolan personally hold direct technical responsibility for the outcome. The man the company had thrown out of its lobby was now the only reason its most important partner had not already walked away. With less than 2 hours left on the clock, the recovery gained momentum, and then it stalled. One cluster of 600 trucks refused to authenticate even after they had received the correct certificates through every proper channel. The engineers threw themselves at the code, hunting for a flaw in the software, but Nolan stepped back from the screens and noticed something the others had missed in their focus. Every one of those 600 stubborn trucks used a controller built in the same single factory. He concluded, with a quiet certainty, that the problem was not in Sentinel Grid at all, but in a hardware key embedded during the manufacturing process itself. Preston, it turned out, had once pressured that factory into using a cheaper component and had concealed the substitution from the safety division entirely. Nolan did not have anywhere near enough time to physically replace the hardware in 600 vehicles scattered across the map. But he remembered that Safe Harbor carried a transitional mode, a fallback he had built years earlier for exactly this situation, for devices manufactured before the current standard existed. That transitional mode could not be triggered by a single central command, and Nolan had designed it that way on purpose. Each truck had to confirm the fallback act through 2 independent sources, a deliberate safeguard against anyone forging a shortcut. Nolan's team coordinated with the regional operations centers scattered across the country and rolled out the dual verification, one careful handshake at a time. While they worked, Vivian personally called each of the remaining partners and admitted the full scope of the incident, rather than continuing to paper over it. That transparency, so unlike the company's old instinct to hide, persuaded two customers who had been on the verge of walking away to hold their positions and wait for the result. The clock showed only 11 minutes remaining when the last cluster of trucks began transmitting confirmation signals. Nolan refused to celebrate early. He insisted that every vehicle complete the full battery of braking and routing checks before a single one of them was allowed back onto the open road. In the final minute, across every display in the operations center, the fleet shifted from red to green. The largest customer confirmed it would not cancel the contract. The regulator granted Aurelius permission to resume operations in staged phases. There had been no serious accident anywhere in the country because Safe Harbor had done precisely the thing Nolan had built it to do, standing between 18,000 trucks and a broken certificate at the exact moment it mattered most. The room erupted, executives and engineers alike on their feet, a wave of relief crashing through people who had not slept in more than a full day. And in the middle of that noise, Nolan quietly unclipped the visitor badge from his shirt and set it down, preparing to leave the company for the second time in 2 days, ready to walk out the same way he had walked out before, without asking for anything. Vivian stopped him before he reached the door and asked him to stay for a company-wide meeting she was about to convene. Nolan assumed she meant to celebrate the engineering team's success and let the rest fade politely into the background. But instead, Vivian opened the meeting by taking responsibility in front of everyone. She told the assembled company, plainly and without softening it, that Nolan had warned them correctly, that she had fired him without ever verifying the file against him, that she had allowed her fear of appearing biased to curdle into a genuine injustice, and that his design had protected thousands of people and rescued Aurelius from ruin. She restored his standing, his salary, and his full benefits, and she did the same for Tessa, Wyatt, and Grant. She did not, however, beg for his forgiveness in front of the crowd, because she understood that a public apology can become its own kind of pressure, a performance designed to force the wronged party into an answer. Gideon and Preston were suspended, their files handed to the investigators, and both now faced a wall of lawsuits from shareholders who had watched their holdings nearly vanish overnight. The board, chastened and desperate to appear responsible, offered Nolan the position of Chief Operating Officer. He declined the title, recognizing it for what it was, a reward meant to look generous while changing nothing underneath. He agreed to return on one condition only, that Aurelius establish an independent safety division reporting directly to the audit committee, with the genuine enforceable power to halt any product it judged dangerous. The board had no real choice but to accept. And so the directors who had smiled the morning Nolan was marched out of the building now found themselves raising their hands to grant him a permanent veto over the company's engineering, a power no amount of ambition could take back. Nolan looked around the table at the faces that had laughed at him, and he spoke the words that closed the door on the world they had tried to keep him in. "Yesterday," he said, "you told me a single father needed this company. Today, this company will have to prove that it deserves to need me." After the meeting emptied, Vivian did not call him her chief engineer or her rescuer. She simply spoke his name and asked whether he could spare her 5 minutes, not as an executive, but as someone who had once been family. They met in an empty office with no board and no cameras, and there Vivian apologized to Nolan in the only way that meant anything, quietly and without an audience. She admitted that she had allowed her ambition to convince her that his calm was a form of weakness, and that she had spent years mistaking the steadiest thing in her life for the least impressive. She apologized, too, for the marriage, for the way she had so often appeared only when she needed him to solve a crisis and vanished into her work the rest of the time. Nolan told her, gently but without any pretense, that saving the company did not mean he had forgotten what she had done. He could forgive her, he said, but trust was a different thing, and trust could only be rebuilt slowly, through actions repeated over a long stretch of time. Vivian accepted this without arguing and without asking him to take her back. She had learned, finally, that some doors do not reopen simply because a person is sorry they closed them. 6 months later, Aurelius had steadied itself. Nolan's independent safety division was functioning exactly as it should, and engineers throughout the company had learned they could report a risk without fearing retaliation for it. Vivian kept her chair after winning a formal vote of confidence, but the way she led had changed at its root, no longer measuring her strength by how little she flinched. She began spending real and regular time with Ellie, refusing to let gifts stand in for the hours she had once been too busy to give. Nolan and Vivian learned to raise their daughter together with more grace than they had ever managed while married, though they kept their boundaries clear and honest. Ellie noticed the change before either of them said a word about it, the way children always notice, and she stopped bracing for the sound of a phone ringing at dinner, stopped waiting for a parent to be pulled away by something more important than she was. That, more than any contract or any vote of confidence, was the thing Nolan counted as the real victory. One evening, after a ceremony announcing the company's new safety standards to the industry, Vivian asked Nolan whether the two of them might begin again over nothing more complicated than a cup of coffee, not as a chief executive and the man who had saved her company, but simply as two people. Nolan did not answer her with a grand promise or a sweeping declaration. He held open the door of the little coffee shop and let her walk in ahead of him. Behind them, the Aurelius building still glowed against the dark skyline, but for the first time in years, neither of them needed a crisis to give them a reason to sit down together.